when somebody reasons into the dark, sometimes into the dark corners of what is allowed or into the dark corners of what's forbidden, if they're doing that in the spirit of a searching desire to see the whole picture, that should be understood as distinct from when people go to the darkest corners because they're afraid of the light or because they know that there nobody will see their crimes. A few comments today about the relationship between inquiry and moderation, or in other words, between philosophy and politics. Inquiry is a double-edged sword when it comes to moderation, because on one hand, thought seeks to exceed boundaries and limitations. Thought is therefore incompatible with ideology, for example, because ideology is a path of thinking that has already set it out in a certain direction at the outset by limiting and constraining what it can think about. If you have an axiom, for example, that diversity is our strength, and you don't consider the possibility that diversity is not our strength, or what kind of diversity is our strength, or in what sense is diversity our strength. So if you just have a starting presupposition that you don't subject to questioning, then your thought is proceeding ideologically in a path that has already been laid out for it. While true inquiry, true philosophical inquiry, doesn't allow itself to be constrained by presupposed views about the nature of human life or the nature of political life. It has to be willing to consider all of the alternatives. So it pokes its nose into the dark corners. It wants to see the big picture, not just the safe version of the picture that's had the extremes cut out, whether they're the extremes of the left or right, or above and below. However you map out political ideas in this sense, philosophical thinking wants to get into all of the alternatives, not just into the sanctioned ones. In that sense, it's immoderate. It exceeds limitations. It exceeds boundaries. It's, in some sense, rebellious against the given order. And it wants to overflow and to fill the space of what's thinkable. Whereas moderation tries to constrain that space, tries to reel thought and practice back into a more manageable domain. So that's the immoderate aspect of inquiry, philosophical inquiry. On the other hand, philosophical inquiry has a moderating effect, or it can have a moderating effect. Because when you are in a situation of ideological combat, culture wars, and left and right at each other's throat, social justice warriors and classical liberals and everybody else so certain of their own first principles that all that's left to do is to destroy one another on YouTube and see who can be the more effective denouncer in chief, and all kinds of rhetoricians and all of that. So that kind of clickbait ideological warfare is a result of the fact that the sides don't have any doubt in their own first principles. Once you're so convinced that the foundational ideas, moral ideas or political ideas have been decided, all that's left is to put them into practice. In the university, that's where you have scholarship as activism. Philosophical inquiry can moderate militant ideological combat by inviting the disputants to consider the status of their presupposed first principles. And that takes time to do. You have to think about the alternatives. You have to learn about the alternatives. You have to consider the arguments. You have to weigh the counter arguments. And when you're doing all of that, you've kind of taken the higher ground. You're no longer down there on the field of battle, so certain that you're representing the right side. You have temporarily called a truce, let's say, in order to be able to subject your own opinions and the opinions of the people with whom you're disputing to greater examination. My view is not that disputation and philosophical discourse are a replacement for political activity. My argument is that philosophical inquiry has the ability to moderate the extremes of ideological possession that often come with their own negative externalities or bad outcomes. So this is a plea for philosophical inquiry, even though it's a double-edged sword, simultaneously immoderate when it comes to the cherished first principles of our party and our fatherland, to the extent to which those are constituted by some sort of partial decision about the good and the just, about the nature of human existence. And on the other hand, to embrace the moderating aspect of philosophical inquiry as concerns the extremes of ideological possession.